Eleanor Blackwood sat alone in the corner booth of Rosie's Diner at 11 p.m., her Hermes scarf draped over shoulders that hadn't known cheap fabric in 40 years. Her eyes fixed on the young black waitress wiping down the counter. The girl moved with an efficiency that spoke of exhaustion mastered. Her dark braids pulled back in a practical ponytail, her worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. Eleanor had been coming here for 7 nights straight, always requesting this section, always ordering the same black coffee she barely touched, always watching. Tonight, she couldn't wait any longer. "Excuse me, dear," she called out, her voice cracking in a way that surprised her. The waitress, Jasmine according to her name tag, approached with a tired but genuine smile. "More coffee, ma'am?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I have a question. A strange one. If you only had 24 hours left to live, what would you do?" Jasmine's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Then she was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting somewhere far away. "I'd find my mother," she said finally. "She left when I was born. I don't hate her. I just want to understand why." The coffee cup slipped from Eleanor's fingers, shattering against the floor, but she didn't notice. She was too busy drowning in the realization that the answer she'd spent 40 years searching for was standing right in front of her, wearing a stained apron and asking if she needed more napkins. Eleanor Blackwood was 62 years old, and she was dying. The doctors had delivered the news 3 months ago with the practiced sympathy of people who delivered death sentences regularly. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, inoperable, 6 months if she was lucky, 3 if she wasn't. She had sat in the oncologist's office in her $12,000 suit, surrounded by diplomas and family photos that belonged to someone else, and felt nothing. Not fear, not sadness, not the desperate clinging to life that the doctors seemed to expect. Just a hollow recognition that she had spent 62 years building an empire and had no one to leave it to. No children, no spouse, no family that hadn't been dead to her for decades. $4 billion in hotels, resorts, and real estate, and she would die alone in a hospital room with hired nurses counting down the minutes until their shift ended. The Blackwood Hotel Group was her legacy. 127 properties across 3 continents, her face on the covers of Forbes and Fortune, her name synonymous with luxury and success. She had built it from nothing, or so the official story went. The daughter of a Virginia tobacco farming family who had rejected their provincial expectations and conquered the world through sheer force of will. It was a good story. It was almost entirely a lie. The truth was messier, darker, soaked in blood, and buried under 40 years of silence. The truth was that Eleanor Blackwood had once been Elizabeth Blackwood, a 19-year-old girl who fell in love with the wrong man and paid for it with everything she had. His name was Marcus Williams. He was 23, a jazz pianist who played at a club in Richmond, his fingers dancing across the keys like they were having a conversation only he could hear. Elizabeth had snuck out of her parents' house to see him perform, drawn by the music that drifted through her bedroom window on summer nights. She had never met a black man before. Not really. Not as a person rather than a servant or a stranger to be avoided. Her family's money came from tobacco, which meant their money came from history they preferred not to examine too closely. But Marcus didn't care about her family's history. He cared about the way she laughed at his jokes, the way she listened when he talked about his dreams, the way she looked at him like he was the only person in the world who mattered. They fell in love in the summer of 1982, meeting in secret, building a world that existed only in stolen moments and whispered promises. By September, Elizabeth was pregnant. By October, her parents had found out. What happened next was something Eleanor had spent 40 years trying to forget, and 40 years unable to escape. Her father, Robert Blackwood, patriarch of the family, pillar of the community, monster in a 3-piece suit, had given her a choice. terminate the pregnancy and never see Marcus again, or be disowned, disinherited, erased from the family as completely as if she had never existed. Elizabeth had refused. She had loved Marcus. She had loved their baby. She had believed, with the naive faith of 19, that love would be enough. She was wrong. Robert Blackwood didn't make threats he wasn't willing to carry out, but he also didn't believe in waste. A grandchild, even a mixed-race grandchild, even a shameful secret, was still a Blackwood, still had value, still could be useful if handled correctly. So instead of forcing an abortion, Robert made other arrangements. He sent Elizabeth away to a facility in upstate New York, a home for unwed mothers, he called it, though it was closer to a prison. He told the community she was studying abroad. He cut off all contact with Marcus, threatening the young musician with arrest, with violence, with the kind of destruction that powerful white men in Virginia could easily arrange for black men who didn't know their place. Marcus disappeared. Elizabeth never found out what happened to him. She spent 8 months in that facility, alone, terrified, feeling her baby grow inside her and knowing that her father had plans she wasn't allowed to know. The birth happened in March of 1983. A girl, perfect and beautiful and screaming with the outrage of new life. Elizabeth held her for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. She had counted every second, memorized every detail, knowing somehow that this was all she would get. She named her Denise, after her grandmother, the only member of her family who had ever shown her genuine kindness. She wrapped the baby in a handkerchief she had embroidered herself, white silk with a delicate E in the corner, one half of a matching pair she had made during the long months of waiting. She whispered promises she wouldn't be allowed to keep. And then her father's men came. They told her the baby had died. Complications during the night. A tragedy, but perhaps a blessing in disguise. Elizabeth had screamed, had fought, had clawed at them with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. They sedated her. When she woke up, she was back in Virginia, in her childhood bedroom, with her father standing over her, explaining how things would be from now on. She would go to college. She would forget this shameful episode. She would never speak of it again. She would marry someone appropriate, someone white, someone from a good family. She would be Eleanor, not Elizabeth. A new name for a new life, the old one buried along with her daughter. And if she ever tried to contact Marcus Williams or investigate what had happened to her baby, her father would make sure that everyone she had ever loved suffered for her disobedience. Eleanor had believed him. She had been 19, broken, grieving, and utterly alone. She had no money of her own, no resources, no one to turn to. So she did what her father demanded. She went to college. She buried Elizabeth and became Eleanor. She married a man her father approved of, a loveless union that ended in divorce after 3 years, leaving her with nothing but a small settlement and a burning determination to never be powerless again. She built her empire one hotel at a time, one deal at a time, one sleepless night at a time. She became rich, then wealthy, then obscenely, impossibly, almost comically rich. She became powerful enough that her father, in his final years, had to come to her for money, had to watch his daughter become everything he had tried to destroy. She had smiled at him across the table in his nursing home and written a check large enough to keep him comfortable until death, and she had felt nothing. But she had never forgotten Denise, never stopped dreaming about the daughter she had held for 4 hours and 17 minutes, never stopped wondering what might have been if she had been braver, stronger, more willing to fight. The dreams had intensified as she got older, as the empire grew and the loneliness deepened. And 3 months ago, when the doctors told her she was dying, Eleanor had made a decision. She would find out what had really happened to her daughter. She would uncover the truth her father had buried. And if there was any justice in the universe, if there was any meaning to the life she had lived, she would find some trace of the baby she had lost 40 years ago. She hired the best private investigators money could buy. She gave them unlimited resources and a simple directive. Find out what happened to Denise Blackwood, born March 15, 1983, at St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers in upstate New York. The investigation took 2 months. The results destroyed everything Eleanor thought she knew about her own life. Denise hadn't died. The death certificate Eleanor's father had shown her was forged. The baby had been sold, there was no other word for it, sold, to an illegal adoption network that specialized in placing unwanted children with families who asked no questions and paid in cash. Robert Blackwood had received $15,000 for his granddaughter. $15,000. Less than the cost of the watch Eleanor was wearing right now. Denise had been placed with a family in Ohio, then removed after 2 years for reasons the records didn't specify. She had bounced through foster homes and group houses for the next 16 years, never staying anywhere long, never finding the stability she needed. At 19, the same age Elizabeth had been when she gave birth, Denise had aged out of the system with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a birth certificate that listed her mother as unknown. The records after that were harder to find, but the investigators were thorough. Denise had worked minimum-wage jobs, struggled with depression, fallen in love with a man who left her pregnant and alone, the pattern repeating itself with cruel precision. She had given birth to a daughter in 2000, named her Jasmine, and tried to make a life for them both. But the depression that had haunted her since childhood deepened after childbirth. The isolation, the poverty, the crushing weight of a history she didn't understand. It was all too much. When Jasmine was 3 months old, Denise had walked out of their apartment and never come back. She had been found 2 weeks later in a motel room in Indiana, empty pill bottles scattered around her, a note that said only, "I'm sorry. I couldn't be what she needed. Please tell her I tried." Jasmine had been raised by Denise's foster mother, a woman named Ruth, who had been the closest thing Denise had ever had to a real parent. Ruth had taken in the baby without hesitation, raised her with love and sacrifice, and died of a heart attack when Jasmine was 15. Jasmine had spent the next 3 years in the foster system herself, had graduated high school against all odds, had been accepted to medical school on a full scholarship, and was currently working 3 jobs to cover the expenses that scholarships didn't include. She was 23 years old, brilliant, determined, and completely unaware that her grandmother was a billionaire who had spent 62 years believing she was alone in the world. The investigators had found one more thing. Ruth, before she died, had given Jasmine a box of her mother's possessions. Among them was a birth certificate, the real one, not the falsified version in official records, that listed the mother as Elizabeth Blackwood. And there was a handkerchief, white silk, yellowed with age, with a delicate E embroidered in the corner, one half of a matching pair. Eleanor had hired the investigators to find traces. Instead, they had found her granddaughter, alive, real, working the night shift at a diner 4 miles from the hotel where Eleanor was staying, completely unaware that her entire history was about to change. Eleanor had driven to Rosie's diner that same night, had walked in at 10 p.m., had seen Jasmine for the first time, and nearly collapsed from the shock. Because Jasmine had Denise's eyes, Denise's smile. Denise's way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Looking at her was like looking at the ghost of the daughter Eleanor had held for 4 hours and 17 minutes, the daughter she had spent 40 years mourning, the daughter she had failed in every way a mother could fail. Eleanor had sat in that booth for 7 nights, watching, gathering courage, trying to find the words for a conversation that had no good beginning. How do you tell a young woman that her grandmother is a dying billionaire? How do you explain 40 years of absence, of silence, of a family history soaked in racism and cruelty and the casual disposal of inconvenient lives? How do you ask for forgiveness when you don't deserve it? Eleanor didn't know, but she was dying. Time was running out. And tonight, when Jasmine had answered her question, "I'd find my mother. I just want to understand why." Eleanor had realized that she couldn't wait any longer. The truth was going to come out. The only question was whether she had the courage to be the one who told it. The coffee was still dripping off the edge of the table when Jasmine grabbed a rag and crouched down to clean up the broken cup. "Ma'am, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor laughed, a strange, strangled sound that was closer to a sob. "Perhaps I have." She watched Jasmine's hands as they gathered the ceramic shards, noticed the calluses on her fingers, the weariness in her movements, the determined set of her jaw. This girl had survived things that would have broken most people. She had been abandoned, orphaned, forgotten by a world that should have protected her. And she was still here, still fighting, still dreaming of becoming a doctor so she could help others. Denise would have been proud. Elizabeth would have been proud. Eleanor was proud, and she had no right to be. "Can I ask you something else?" Eleanor's voice was steadier now, though her hands were still trembling. "Something personal?" Jasmine deposited the broken cup in a nearby trash bin and straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression was guarded but curious, the look of someone who had learned to be careful with strangers but hadn't lost her fundamental kindness. "I guess so. You're kind of my only customer right now." She gestured at the empty diner, the rain streaking the windows, the clock on the wall showing 11:23 p.m. "What do you want to know?" Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, creased and faded, but still clear enough to make out the image. A young black man sitting at a piano, his eyes closed, his fingers frozen in mid-motion, his face illuminated by stage lights. "Have you ever seen this man?" Jasmine took the photograph, studied it with the careful attention of someone used to being given puzzles without context. "No, I don't think so." "Who is he?" "His name was Marcus Williams. He was a jazz pianist in Richmond, Virginia in the early 1980s. Eleanor paused, feeling the weight of 4 decades pressing down on her chest. "He was your grandfather." The diner went silent. Not the comfortable silence of an empty restaurant late at night, but the ringing silence of a world that had just shifted on its axis. Jasmine stared at the photograph, then at Eleanor, then back at the photograph. Her expression cycled through confusion, suspicion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear. I don't understand. My grandfather? I don't have a grandfather. I don't have any family. My mother..." She stopped, her voice cracking. "My mother left when I was 3 months old. I never knew anything about my father's side and my mother's family." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know who you are, lady, but if this is some kind of scam..." "It's not a scam." Eleanor reached into her purse again and pulled out another item, a handkerchief. White silk, yellowed with age, with a delicate E embroidered in the corner. She set it on the table between them. "I have something that belongs to you, or rather, something that belongs to your family." Jasmine's face went pale. Her hand moved automatically to the pocket of her apron, where Eleanor could see the outline of something soft and folded. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It matches mine. The one my mother, the one Ruth gave me, from my mother's things." She pulled out her own handkerchief, identical to Eleanor's except for the wear patterns, and laid it on the table beside the first. 2 halves of a matching pair, separated for 40 years, finally reunited. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," Eleanor said quietly. 40 years ago, my name was Elizabeth. I was 19 years old and I fell in love with Marcus Williams, and I got pregnant. And my father... She couldn't finish the sentence. The tears were coming now, tears she had held back for 40 years, tears she had thought herself incapable of shedding. "He took my baby. He told me she died. He sold her to an adoption agency and kept the money and let me believe I had lost everything. And I believed him. For 40 years, I believed him. I thought your mother was dead. I thought I was alone. I built an empire and made billions of dollars and never stopped dreaming about the daughter I held for 4 hours and 17 minutes before they ripped her away from me. Jasmine was trembling now, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid. You're saying you're my... Your grandmother. Denise was my daughter. You are my granddaughter. Eleanor's voice broke completely. And I am so sorry for everything you've been through, for everything your mother went through. For the 40 years I wasn't there because I didn't know, because I believed the lie, because I was too broken to fight back when I should have fought harder. The clock on the wall ticked. The rain continued to fall. Somewhere in the kitchen, a radio played a song that neither of them could hear over the roaring in their ears. Jasmine stood frozen, her face a battlefield of emotions. Anger and grief and hope and suspicion, all warring for dominance. When she finally spoke, her voice was hard and cold and nothing like the warm tone she had used with customers all night. You're telling me that my mother spent her entire life thinking she was abandoned, that she grew up in foster homes, got passed around like unwanted furniture, developed depression so severe she couldn't even take care of her own baby, that she walked out when I was 3 months old because she couldn't handle being a mother because no one had ever mothered her. Jasmine's voice rose with each sentence. And you're saying it's all because your father was a racist who couldn't handle his daughter loving a black man? You're saying my entire family history, the abandonment, the poverty, the suicide, the years I spent wondering what I did wrong to make my mother leave. All of it happened because of your father's bigotry and your family's money. Eleanor flinched at each word, but she didn't look away. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I know nothing I say can make it right. I know nothing I do can bring back your mother or give you the childhood you deserved. I know I have no right to sit here and ask for anything from you. She reached across the table, her hand hovering over Jasmine's but not quite touching. But I'm dying. I have cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. And before I go, I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that you were never unwanted, that your mother was never unwanted, that the only unwanted thing in this entire tragic story is the cruelty of a man who thought his family's reputation was worth more than his granddaughter's life. Jasmine's hand shot out and grabbed Eleanor's wrist with surprising strength. Dying? You're dying. The anger in her voice shifted, complicated by something that might have been concern. How long have you known? 3 months. I found out the same day I started searching for you. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. I spent 62 years building a fortune and a legacy, and none of it means anything because I have no one to share it with. I thought my daughter was dead. I thought I was alone. And then my investigators found you, and I found out that I wasn't alone. That I had a granddaughter who survived everything the world threw at her and was putting herself through medical school and working 3 jobs and still had enough kindness left to answer a strange old woman's question at 11 p.m. in an empty diner. She turned her hand over, gripping Jasmine's in return. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to have the choice that your mother never had, the choice to know where you come from, to understand why things happened the way they did, to decide for yourself what you want to do with that knowledge. Jasmine was crying now. Tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to suppress. I used to dream about this. When I was little, I used to lie awake at night and imagine that my mother had a good reason for leaving, that she wasn't abandoning me, that she was trying to protect me, or that she was taken away, or that somewhere out there she was looking for me just as hard as I was looking for her. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. And now you're telling me it was all true? Not about my mother, but about you. That somewhere out there was a grandmother who wanted me, who mourned me, who didn't know I existed. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through her own tears. 40 years of grief, 40 years of silence, 40 years of pretending she was fine when she was dying inside. All of it came pouring out in that empty diner, in front of a granddaughter she had just met, at 11:30 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night. The two women held hands across the table and cried together, the handkerchiefs lying between them like evidence in a trial that had taken 4 decades to convene. It was almost midnight when Jasmine finally spoke again. Her voice was steadier now, though her eyes were still red and swollen. You said my great-grandfather, your father, is the one who did this, who sold my mother to that adoption agency, who forged the death certificate, who kept this secret for 40 years. She paused, something dangerous flickering in her expression. Is he still alive? Eleanor's jaw tightened. Yes, he's 89 years old, in a nursing home in Richmond. Dementia has taken most of his mind, but he still has lucid moments. The family fortune is gone. I made sure of that years ago, when I became successful enough to cut him off. But he's still alive, still breathing, still protected by the wealth he accumulated through cruelty and racism and the casual destruction of anyone who got in his way. Jasmine stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I want to meet him. Her voice was flat, determined. I want to look him in the face and tell him what his decisions cost. I want him to see me, his great-granddaughter, the descendant he tried to erase, and know that I survived, that his cruelty didn't destroy our family, that we're still here. She looked at Eleanor with eyes that were ancient with inherited grief. Will you take me to him? The drive to Richmond took 4 hours. Eleanor arranged for a private car, canceled her morning meetings, and watched the Virginia countryside roll past the tinted windows while Jasmine sat beside her, reviewing the documents the investigators had compiled. Birth certificates, adoption records, financial transactions showing the $15,000 payment. Robert Blackwood's signature on a dozen forms that proved his involvement in the disposal of his own granddaughter. Jasmine read each page with the clinical detachment of a medical student reviewing a case file, but Eleanor could see her hands trembling, could see the way her jaw clenched at each new revelation. There's something else you should know, Eleanor said as they crossed into Virginia. About your grandfather, Marcus. Jasmine looked up from the documents. The pianist? What happened to him? Eleanor's voice was quiet, heavy with old grief. After my father found out about us, he made threats, serious threats, the kind that white men in Virginia could carry out against black men without any consequences. Marcus disappeared. I never found out what happened to him. I looked after I got free of my father, but the trail was 40 years cold by then. All I know is that he vanished from Richmond in November of 1982 and was never seen again. Jasmine was silent for a long moment. Then, you think your father killed him? It wasn't a question. Eleanor couldn't answer. She had asked herself that question 1,000 times over the decades, had tortured herself with possibilities and probabilities, had never been able to face the most likely truth. Robert Blackwood was capable of murder. He had proved that by selling his own granddaughter. What was one more black life to a man who saw black lives as commodities? They arrived at Whispering Pines nursing home at 7 a.m. The facility was expensive, private, the kind of place where wealthy families deposited inconvenient relatives when they no longer wanted to deal with them. Eleanor had been paying for her father's care for 15 years, not out of love, but out of a cold desire to keep him alive long enough to watch everything he valued crumble. She had taken his fortune. She had destroyed his reputation. She had made sure that the Blackwood name was synonymous with her success, not his legacy. But she had never confronted him directly. She had never had the courage. Until now. Robert Blackwood was sitting in a wheelchair by the window when they entered his room. He was a shell of the man Eleanor remembered, thin and frail, his skin papery and spotted, his eyes clouded with age and confusion. But when Eleanor walked in, something flickered in those eyes. Recognition, and something that might have been fear. "Elizabeth?" His voice was a raspy whisper. "You came back." Eleanor's heart clenched at the sound of her old name. "Yes, Father. I came back. And I brought someone you should meet." She stepped aside, revealing Jasmine standing in the doorway. "This is Jasmine Williams, your great-granddaughter, the baby you sold for $15,000 in 1983, the descendant you tried to erase." Robert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, recognition, and finally something that looked almost like terror. "No. No, that's not. That child is dead. The child died. I have the certificate." "You have forgeries," Jasmine interrupted, stepping into the room. Her voice was steady and cold, but her eyes were blazing. "You have lies. You have 40 years of cruelty and silence, but you don't have power anymore, Mr. Blackwood. You don't have money. You don't have the ability to make people disappear or buy your way out of consequences." She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, each step an accusation. "My mother grew up thinking she was worthless because no one wanted her. She developed depression so severe she couldn't function. She abandoned me when I was 3 months old because she didn't know how to be a mother because no one had ever mothered her. And then she killed herself in a motel room in Indiana, alone, with a note that said she was sorry she couldn't be what I needed." Jasmine stopped directly in front of Robert's wheelchair, close enough to touch him, close enough to see every tremor of his withered hands. "She was 37 years old. She never got to see me graduate high school. She never got to see me get into medical school. She never got to meet her own mother because you stole that from her before she was even born." Jasmine's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "And I spent my entire childhood wondering what I did wrong, wondering why my mother left, wondering why I wasn't enough for her to stay. Do you understand what that does to a child, Mr. Blackwood? Do you have any concept of the damage you caused?" Robert's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to Eleanor as if seeking help, but Eleanor just stood by the door with her arms crossed, watching her father face the consequences of his cruelty for the first time in his miserable life. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice barely audible. "I did what I had to do. For the family. For the name. You don't understand what it was like back then. A mixed child. The scandal. The shame." "Shame?" Jasmine's voice rose to a shout. "You're talking to me about shame? You sold a baby, your own grandchild, because you were worried about what the neighbors would think. You destroyed 3 generations of women because you couldn't handle your daughter loving a black man. And now you're sitting here, at the end of your pathetic life, in a nursing home paid for by the daughter you abused, trying to justify yourself with talk about family and names and shame." She leaned in close, her face inches from his. "You don't have a family, Mr. Blackwood. You have victims, and we survived you." Robert started to cry, thin, reedy sobs that shook his frail body. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You don't get to apologize. You don't get to cry and pretend you're the victim. You get to sit here in this room, alone, with no one to visit you except the daughter you tried to destroy, and you get to live with the knowledge that everything you did was for nothing. Your legacy is gone. Your name means nothing. The only Blackwood anyone remembers is me. The daughter you tried to erase, the woman who built an empire out of the ashes of your cruelty. And now your great-granddaughter is going to become a doctor. She's going to save lives while you rot in this room waiting to die. That's your legacy, Father. That's what all your scheming and racism and violence achieved, a family that thrived without you." They left Robert Blackwood sobbing in his wheelchair, alone in his expensive room with his expensive regrets. In the car on the way back to Chicago, Jasmine was quiet for a long time. Eleanor let the silence stretch, giving her granddaughter the space she needed to process everything that had happened. Finally, as they crossed the state line, Jasmine spoke. "Thank you for taking me there, for letting me say what I needed to say." Eleanor reached over and took her hand. "Thank you for being brave enough to say it. I've been wanting to tell him the truth for 40 years. I was never strong enough to do it alone." Jasmine turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something new in her granddaughter's eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it, the beginning of understanding. "You said you're dying. How much time do you have?" "The doctors say 6 months. Could be less." Eleanor squeezed Jasmine's hand. "I've made arrangements. My estate, my company, everything I've built. It's yours. Or it will be when I'm gone. I've already changed the paperwork. You're my sole heir." Jasmine's eyes widened. "I can't. That's billions of dollars. I'm a waitress. I'm a medical student. I don't know anything about running a hotel empire." "You don't have to run it," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You can sell it, donate it, let the board of directors handle everything while you focus on your medical career. It's your choice. All I ask is that you use some of it to do what I never could, to make sure that what happened to our family never happens to anyone else. There are other children out there who were sold, other families who were torn apart by racism and cruelty, other histories that have been buried and forgotten. Find them, help them, give them the truth that was stolen from them." Jasmine was quiet again, staring out the window at the passing countryside. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "My mother spent her whole life feeling worthless, feeling unwanted. She didn't know she came from anyone who loved her. She didn't know her mother was out there, thinking about her, grieving for her, building an empire with a hole in her heart where a daughter should have been." She turned to Eleanor, tears streaming down her face. "I used to blame her for leaving. I used to think she was weak or selfish, or that she just didn't love me enough to stay. But now I understand. She was carrying so much pain, so much history, so much trauma that she didn't even know the source of. She wasn't weak. She was crushed. And she still managed to give me life, to give me to Ruth, to make sure I survived even when she couldn't anymore." Eleanor nodded, her own tears falling freely. "Your mother was the strongest person I never knew. She survived things that would have destroyed most people. And she created you, this brilliant, determined, compassionate woman who is going to change the world. That's her legacy. That's what she left behind. Not the pain, not the abandonment, you." The next 6 months were the most meaningful of Eleanor Blackwood's life. She moved to Chicago to be closer to Jasmine, renting an apartment near the hospital where her granddaughter was doing her clinical rotations. She attended Jasmine's classes, met her professors, learned about the woman her granddaughter was becoming. She told Jasmine everything she remembered about Marcus Williams, his music, his laugh, the way he made Eleanor feel like she could be anyone she wanted to be. She helped Jasmine access DNA databases and historical records, searching for any trace of the grandfather neither of them had been able to find. They found him 3 months before Eleanor died. Or rather, they found his grave, a small marker in a cemetery outside Richmond, dated November 1982. Marcus Williams had been found dead in his apartment a week after Eleanor's father discovered their relationship. The official cause of death was suicide. But the investigators Eleanor hired found inconsistencies in the police report, witnesses who had been paid to stay quiet, evidence that pointed to foul play. Robert Blackwood had killed Marcus Williams. He had murdered the man his daughter loved and then convinced her that she was alone, that the baby was dead, that her only option was to submit to his control. Eleanor didn't have the strength to pursue justice for Marcus. The cancer was progressing faster than expected, and the doctors had revised their estimate to weeks rather than months. But she made sure Jasmine had everything she needed to continue the investigation after she was gone. The documents, the contacts, the financial resources to hire the best lawyers and investigators in the country. "Finish what I started," she told Jasmine, holding her hand in the hospice room. "Find the truth about your grandfather. Make sure the world knows what my father did, and then let it go. Don't let the past consume you the way it consumed me. Build something beautiful with your life. That's the best revenge we can have." Eleanor Blackwood died on a Tuesday morning in April, with Jasmine holding her hand and the two matching handkerchiefs draped across her chest. She was 63 years old. She had spent 40 years building an empire and 6 months finding a family. In the end, she said, the 6 months were worth more than all the billions combined. Jasmine was with her when she took her final breath, and she whispered the last words Eleanor ever heard. "Thank you for finding me, for telling me the truth, for giving me a history I didn't know I had." Eleanor smiled, squeezed her granddaughter's hand one last time, and was gone. The funeral was private, attended only by Jasmine and a few of Eleanor's most trusted employees. But the aftermath was very public indeed. Eleanor's will was read 2 weeks after her death, revealing that she had left her entire $4 billion estate to a granddaughter no one knew existed. The media went into a frenzy. Reporters camped outside Jasmine's apartment, demanded interviews, dug into her background looking for scandal. Jasmine refused every request. She had work to do, and she wasn't interested in being a celebrity. The Eleanor Blackwood Foundation was established 6 months later, funded with $2 billion from the estate. Its mission was to investigate historical cases of family separation, forced adoption, and racial violence, and to provide resources and support for families seeking to uncover buried truths. In its first year, the foundation helped 342 families find lost relatives, exposed 7 adoption agencies that had operated illegally in the mid-20th century, and funded a landmark lawsuit that resulted in the first-ever criminal conviction for a living participant in the forced adoption trade. Jasmine completed her medical degree 3 years later, specializing in psychiatry with a focus on intergenerational trauma. She opened a clinic in Chicago's South Side, providing free mental health services to families dealing with the psychological aftermath of historical injustice. She named it the Denise Williams Center, after the mother she had never known but had finally come to understand. The investigation into Marcus Williams's death took 5 years, but Jasmine never gave up. In the end, she found what she was looking for. Testimony from a former employee of Robert Blackwood's who had witnessed the murder and been paid to keep silent for 40 years. The witness was dying of cancer himself, and he wanted to confess before he met his maker. His testimony, combined with the documentary evidence Eleanor had gathered, was enough to reopen the case. Robert Blackwood died before he could be charged, passing away in his nursing home room 3 years after Eleanor's confrontation. But the truth came out anyway. Jasmine made sure of it. She gave interviews, wrote articles, testified before Congress about the need for accountability in historical cases of racial violence. Marcus Williams' grave was moved to a place of honor in a Richmond cemetery, and a scholarship fund was established in his name for young black musicians pursuing careers in jazz. On the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's death, Jasmine stood before a crowd of 500 people at the dedication of the Marcus and Eleanor Williams Center for Family Reunification, a new wing of the foundation's headquarters, built on land that had once belonged to the Blackwood family estate in Virginia. She wore both handkerchiefs pinned to her jacket, the matching ease visible for everyone to see. "My grandmother asked me a question once," Jasmine told the crowd. "She asked me what I would do if I only had 24 hours to live. I told her I would find my mother. I wanted to understand why she left." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. families who had been reunited through the Foundation's work, survivors of historical injustice who had finally found answers, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who had been erased from history. I never got to find my mother. She died before I knew to look for her, but I found my grandmother. I found my grandfather's story. I found a history that had been stolen from me, and I found the strength to reclaim it. Her voice rose, carrying across the crowd. Every person in this room has a story like mine, a family member who was lost, a truth that was buried, a history that someone tried to erase. But we're still here. Our stories are still here. And as long as we keep telling them, as long as we keep searching and fighting and refusing to be silent, no one can truly erase us. She looked up at the sky, where clouds were gathering, but the sun was still shining through. My grandmother spent 40 years believing she was alone. She built an empire, but she was empty inside. And then she found me, a waitress in a diner at 11 p.m., answering questions for a strange old woman who turned out to be the family I never knew I had. Jasmine smiled, her eyes bright with tears. She asked me what I would do with 24 hours. But the truth is, it doesn't take 24 hours to change everything. Sometimes it only takes one question, one answer, one person brave enough to tell the truth. She touched the handkerchiefs on her jacket, feeling the weight of 4 generations pressing against her heart. My great-grandfather tried to erase us. He failed. My grandmother tried to find us. She succeeded. And now I'm standing here, a doctor and a daughter and a granddaughter and a great-granddaughter of people who loved each other across every barrier that hate could build. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. That's the answer to the question, really. What would I do with 24 hours? I would love the people who are still here. I would honor the people who are gone. And I would make sure that no one ever has to wonder where they came from again. The crowd rose to their feet, applause thundering through the hall. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to rest, Eleanor Blackwood smiled. She had spent 62 years building an empire. But her greatest legacy wasn't the hotels or the billions or the foundation. It was the granddaughter who had refused her money and demanded her truth. It was the family that had survived everything. It was the love that, in the end, was always enough.